A sower went out to sow seeds in the field. Some seeds fell on rocky ground, and they were scorched. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns choked them. And some fell on good soil and produced grain. And Jesus taught them, saying, "If a man has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 in the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish." The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who, upon finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it.
Well, good morning. Great to see you, fellowship. My name is Rick. I'm one of the pastors here. What a privilege to be here. And I'm going to take a moment just because I can. That was all wonderful and beautiful. And I think the students would want me to say this. That Blair Benefield has been the leader of that village. Blair, you have served so faithfully. My emotion comes from just thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And Disa. And your boys. Blair, thank you, Jesus, is going to remain with us as he continues to be an overseer, but not hands-on, but overseeing this incredible team of Zach Hume that's being built, that Zach Hume's leading and building in our student ministries. And he has a role, there's a gifting Blair has that we need in building the future of this church at a leadership level. And Blair, we're just so glad you're there, but well done, good and faithful, sir. If you don't, yes. If you don't follow Blair on Facebook, you should be. He is recounting all the years and decades of his student ministry that have culminated in this last year of his transition out of hands-on student ministry. It's just so passionate and so powerful, and I've learned so much and appreciate you so much. I would also like to say that I've been lead pastor of this church since before you all were born. And only twice have we had a moment where at the last minute, the night before, the teacher couldn't teach. February of 2022 and last night. RD says, "I'm stuck in Maine. I can't get out of Maine. The toilet's broken on the plane. They won't fly us out." Then the weather came in. So at 6 o'clock last night, I found out I was going to preach, just like I did in February. Sarah Scott, who you may know on our staff, she is, if you're here this morning, you're here because Sarah Scott made it happen. She's an incredible servant and leader and just making Sunday morning happen. But Sarah said, "Perhaps, Rick, now you are the pastor of spontaneous preaching." To which I replied, "Get behind me, Satan." Okay, too strong, but here we go. 4 o'clock this morning, here we go. All right, so I'm going to invite you to be surprised by Jesus. No pun intended. It's actually a sermon I had thought about doing in a couple of weeks on Gospel Sunday. We're just going to do it this morning. The thoughts are clear. Whether or not the teaching is, I'll leave that up to you to decide. Aiden started us in worship this morning. And by the way, this worship team, I've watched them worship when nobody's watching. And what you saw this morning is not performance, it's heart. It's invitation to you, and I'm so proud of them. But Aiden started this song, "Come Like You Want To, Jesus, Have Your Way." I'm going to invite you there this morning. I'm going to invite you to experience Jesus having his way. Now, not like when you get home. I'm literally at the end, we're going to pray, we're going to sing, and we're going to pray. Because that's what this teaching is about. Because Jesus will surprise us when he shows up. Now, I'm going back to a passage. It's the calling of Matthew or the calling of Levi, which is another name. And I apologize for Michael, who's back in the state. Would you bring me like a tissue or something? I'm all whatever from allergies and crying about Blair. So maybe I'm just allergic to teaching at the last minute. So anyway, I'm going to go back to a passage because I'm going to take you to another layer. because I've been going on that layer ever since I taught it. God's just been bringing me back, and I want to share it with you. And it's a passage we looked a lot about expectations and the shepherd and Jesus, but I'm going to go at this in a different angle, and it kind of builds on the other. So here's what I said last time I taught this passage. When Jesus calls you to himself, he calls you to die to yourself. Oh, bless you. Thank you, Tony. Thank you so very much. I do not know how I know how to do this. Hold on, I'll turn it off. Back on? That's the extent of my tactical skills right there, so here we go. When your life, the gift of being called to die yourself is when your life becomes his life becomes yours. Amen? When we talk about being a new person in a new family on a new mission, we're not talking about like kind of receiving marching orders. We're talking about receiving his life. And Paul said it this way: I've been crucified with Christ, which means my confidence and my rootedness and my identity in being what I can do and what I have and who I become, I have put that on a cross with Jesus so that my identity is who he is and what he's accomplished and that I belong to him. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. That's what we want to understand more this morning. How does this actually happen? What's the learning of, how do you learn this? As importantly, what do you need to unlearn so you can learn this? What's the learning and the unlearning? How does it look like that you do this on and on, that it's an ongoing process? It's a day by day. It's not a, well, I've been and I'm done. Paul's saying, I now live. Yes, this happened, but this is how I live. What would it look like for you to live that way? Well, I think the calling of Matthew gives us a chance to look at that in some new ways. So, Matthew 9:9, as Jesus passed on from there, and I won't give a lot of context here or a lot of details because we've already done that before. If you want to go back and hear that and get the whole, you can. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. It's well rehearsed how the tax collectors were considered the worst of the worst. They were betrayers, liars, stealers, thieves, ill repute. And Matthew evidently, without going into details, the worst of the worst, because the worst kind were the ones who had authority to tax anything they wanted with you, could do anything at any time, and they could actually take that tax. They weren't just collecting for someone, they weren't overseeing collectors. They were in your face, in your life, coming by and say, hey, I think that vehicle is actually worth this. It's not. Yes, it is. I think your home's actually worth this. I think, let's just tax your children. Let's just tax everything. And he could do that, and there's nothing you could do about it. And so he's sitting at this booth, and he follows Jesus. And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, so they moved from there to a house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. Note the word many. It's full, it's bursting full, because for Matthew, a person of influence and wealth and power, to have made this commitment, he's invited everybody. Hey, y'all need to come and see this guy. It probably didn't say y'all, but anyway, you come and see this person. I want you to hear what he has to say. And so he's invited him. And think about a room full of tax collectors. Can you imagine the posturing that's going on in there? The wealthiest, the most powerful, whose identity was in being able to be God of your life, basically, because they were God of your finances. The posturing, the loudness, all that's taking place. And here we have Jesus reclining for a meal, which in this culture is like a deep acceptance. They're accepting him into a hospitality of a meal, and he's accepting them around the table with him. And the Pharisees will look at this and say, it's not right for these tax collectors to have a rabbi in their house, and it's all wrong for the rabbi to be there. So when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? You need to hear it this way. What's wrong with your teacher? What is wrong with you? That finger pointing of condemnation is like the Pharisees and the scribes' go-to move. What's wrong with you? As I stand over you, a man of learning, great education, wisdom you could never have, studied knowledge of the scriptures you will never gain. And I stand over you and say, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with this teacher? It's the finger of pointing of shame. But when Jesus heard it, and I love this, Jesus heard it. He wasn't even talking to Jesus. Jesus kind of hears this, and he moves in like Jesus does. He says, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. And then he says this. That was offensive because he's basically saying these people are sick. And they were like, okay, well, they're kind of sick. I get that. But then he says, go and learn. Can you imagine what happens internally with a Pharisee or a scribe right now? They are used to being the smartest person in the room. They are the experts. They are the powerful religious people. And Jesus has basically said, you don't understand what you're even talking about. You should go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous but sinners. And we'll look at that out of Hosea later in this morning. Now, I preached this, I don't know when, a while back, and I preached the calling of the disciples, Matthew 10. And it just sat so deeply on me. In between all that, I was at a men's retreat for Fellowship Church. It was just incomparably powerful. I had some things happen in my own personal life, some of my relationships, where I saw Jesus show up and move in some ways I didn't expect, but in me, I hope when you listen to these teachings, and we appreciate your affirmation, we really do. It's a gift. We're thankful for having a teaching team. I mean, how many churches have 4 pastors who teach? And who somebody can get up spontaneously because we've got someone. Where does that? We have that. But here's the thing, there is such a difference. In this passage in Hosea, in this conversation with Jesus having with them is this. It's one thing to have knowledge about God. It is something completely radically different to have knowledge of God. I want to talk to you about how we gain knowledge of God. Even as you come week to week and you listen to these sermons and you do your own Bible studies or however you, knowledge of God. So, it's really hard for me to complain about having to kind of come up spontaneously because I just came off 2 weeks with my wife in Europe. So who's going to complain, right? And in Rome, a 5-minute walk from us was a basilica that is a French-speaking basilica, which houses 3 paintings by my favorite Renaissance painter of all, Caravaggio. I've mentioned Caravaggio before. I could spend 2 hours telling you why I love Caravaggio. But I want to show you how he thinks about the calling of Levi. Now, let me say this. You ready? This is so important. Songs, art, experiences are powerful parts of how we have knowledge of God. Stories. We're wired as whole people learners. You have to be careful, though. Your knowledge about God comes from Scripture. Because if you let your experiences teach you about your knowledge of God, you're going to get some things really way off because art's not, it's not intended to be a detailed, explicit, one-to-one correlation. It's intended to communicate something. So if you're not used to looking at art, and I show you this, you say, well, that wasn't in the text, that wasn't how. Relax. Let Caravaggio interpret his understanding of this. Remember what the scriptures say. But here's what Caravaggio does. So here's the painting, The Calling of Matthew. And I'm going to zoom in on it in just a moment. One thing about Caravaggio, if you go in this basilica and you see any artwork from this period of time, you still got the cherubs, the halos, the kind of pale round faces and Virgin Mary, and you've got all these kind of ethereal, representational kinds of things. When Caravaggio paints, he paints, those are actually his friends in the picture wearing the garments of the day because Caravaggio is wrestling with how do you bring Jesus into the moment of my reality. Now you're also saying, some of you, but Caravaggio was a mess. Yes, he was. It's interesting how messy people often see things about God that others don't. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit and show you a couple more things about this painting. First of all, this right here, you may recognize that form. Because Michelangelo Caravaggio, Michelangelo was his first name, painted this in an exact representation of the moment when Adam and God's fingers touch in the Sistine Chapel. You with me on this? Only Caravaggio used Adam's hand for Jesus' hand, because the divine moment has come through the human form. And he wants you to understand that. He also wants you to see that there is a light coming in from behind Jesus, and the glory and the revelation and the light is shining on Matthew. And Matthew is the only one looking at Jesus, because his colleagues are counting their money. Now there's an hour right there. I'll just let that sit with you a moment. If you don't appreciate art, please learn to. If you don't appreciate music and representation that's not exactly what we would call literal, please learn to. Because it will stir emotions and ask questions in you. And you might have a moment where you actually look at Matthew and you see him pointing back at himself like, who, me? Me? The rabbi who calls himself Messiah walked in the room and he said, you, Matthew, I chose you. Follow me. The surprise on Matthew's face. When I went in this basilica and I saw this painting, I said, I know what that's like, Matthew. Who, me? Really? This ornate church with beautiful gold and stained glass and paintings that are priceless. The thing I walk away with is me. Like today and yesterday, yeah, me. He's surprised. We interview, because we've been in a major transition, like Blair's position changing, we've done a lot of transitions. There have been a few open spots here, and God, as he always does at Fellowship, just as he set us up in the 2010s with this incredible staff to build that generation and decade, we now have this new staff for the 2020s and 2030s, and just seeing God bring these folks, I could just tell you stories about each one and would love to. If you find out someone just came on staff, please get to know them, whether they're pastoral or staff. But in the last interview I had right before I left, or actually while I was gone, it was a video. Came in as a video part of it. I asked our candidate, who has verbally said yes, and I hope will sign the paper because he's wonderful. But I asked our candidate, since you've come to know Jesus, what has surprised you the most about him? What surprised you the most about Jesus? I shared that with my wife, and she said, well, what surprises you about Jesus? I'm about to tell you. But I won't get it any more powerful than that. Be a new person, a new family on a new mission, people. It's not about trying to make the church work. I'm all in on that. I lead this thing, you know what I'm saying? But there's such a higher purpose. Paul said this, therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him, we have also obtained access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Later, we're going to sing about the glory of God, showing us his glory. The most powerful way you will ever see the glory of God is to gain access by faith to the grace that gives you hope. Not in yourself, and not in your bank account, and not in the political administration, and not in the church organization, and not in your kids succeeding, not in your health, not in your gifting, not in your marriage, to find this access to hope in a new life. Not only that, Paul says we rejoice in our suffering. Even when we're suffering, we can stay engaged and connected, knowing that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. There's the word. All that we might experience, even the hardest parts. The believers in Ukraine are not being put to shame. Some of them are dying, and all of them are suffering, but they're not being put to shame. Because God's love has poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who's been given to us. How much more so should we in this moment that we have not be put to shame? For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person. Like Paul's saying, you don't like kind of look for opportunities to die for people no matter how good they are. You might die for somebody who's good, but for a person you absolutely know in every detail and aspect is an ungodly person deserving death and the wrath of a holy God. And Jesus, though perhaps for a good person one would dare to even to die, but God shows his love for us, and that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Me and you. And it's not just a one and done. It is a daily. To follow Jesus is a daily. It's a daily being surprised by him. It's a daily seeing him show up with hope you didn't think you had. It's a daily finding out you need to die to that. That thing you're grasping so hard. College students, those of you who are headed to campuses around our country, there are so many lies out there. You are headed into, you say, well, I'm going to a Christian college. There are so many lies out there. I've been a professor of a Christian college. I loved it, wonderful, all 4 Christian colleges. It's people. And it's a culture that says you get a pass on everything that happens to you in college. It's just no big deal, because after it's done, you can just go back to living a good life. Instead of, college actually is one of the most significant opportunities for you to be surprised by Jesus. And if you screw it up, which multitudes have, and maybe you already have, you will have to pay off those emotional debts. They don't just go away. And you know what? Jesus will redeem those too, because it's not about you. So you have the freedom to fail, but don't ever imagine you fail without consequences. Does that make sense? Jesus is good in all of it. Hold fast to the truth. And so should we. You know, Matthew's sitting here, he doesn't even know 10% of the story. He doesn't even know 10% of what he's even gotten himself into. When I was the age of these high school seniors, I didn't know 10%. Now I don't know 1%. Like, he surprises me, because when your life becomes his life becomes yours, and here's what he does. Here's what he does. He pursues the death, darkness, and sin in us because of his great love for us, and because it is the only way for us to access his life, his light, and his righteousness. It's the only way we're going to get there. He knows it. He knows it. And because he loves you, he pursues you. And he keeps pursuing these pieces of you that are just so hard to understand. You see, here's my expectations of how my spiritual journey with Jesus should work. I've got places in me that are dark, ugly motivations, things I talk to my closest people about, but I'm not talking to you about it. I've got death in me. I've got things that still just haven't been surrendered to him. There's just stuff. And I've got sin. So my thought is, I'll hide that, I'll make myself stronger, I'll attain goodness, and I can diminish and overcome the places of death and darkness and sin in me. I just need to work harder and be more religious and get this thing taken care of. But it doesn't work. First of all, it exhausts you. And second of all, you actually wind up more isolated. And guess what happens when you're more isolated? It gets worse. So yesterday I went to Home Depot because I'm going to do a home project. Some of you know me in home projects. I embrace that it's for my sanctification purposes, but I don't like it. So all I had to do, I'm making these boxes for my wife. And by the way, like we've been gone a lot, so I've got to catch up to May. You know, I worked like a dog yesterday. My little Whoop, which is my fitness bit on steroids thing I wear, it said I burned 6,000 calories yesterday. Get that, wrap your brain around that. I'm 61 years old. I burned 6,000 calories. So at the end of the day, when I messed up on the boxes and then realized they were cut the wrong length, because when I went to Home Depot, I said, cut these in halves and fourths because I'm a smart guy. And if you'll just do that to my 2x10, 12-foot board will be perfect. Evidently, I must have handed them a 2x10 by 16. Because it was, yeah, I know. Thank you, Jerome. Jerome, it weighed more than me, brother. And we cut it all wrong. Now I got to recut it with a bad attitude, having just found out I'm going to preach this morning on Jesus. Coming down walking down by my neighbor, who's this wonderful, gracious man, he looked at me and said, "Are you okay?" Like, I'm okay. I said, "Do I look bad?" He said, "I don't know. You need to go get a glass of water. And I got a saw. I'll cut those for you." I'm like, okay. I didn't really want my neighbor to know how stupid I am when it comes to these things. It's the only way I'm going to get help. I lead a lot of men's groups. I'm going to speak to men now. Women, I'd love to speak to you in this, but I'm going to speak to men. This doesn't work. Men in our culture live isolated lives. It doesn't work. You never get the help that you need. You see, what Jesus is committed to is what he does with Matthew, he does with us. He wants to expose that shame. Jesus wants to meet him. I'm just going to expose my shame and meet him in my weakness. That's what he wants me. He wants to meet me in my weakness. Jesus wants me to receive his righteousness and get over myself of thinking that somehow I'm going to do enough, be enough, have enough, this is going to be okay. And he wants me to embrace and be embraced by him in places of death, darkness, and sin in me. And he wants it every day. Are you with me? Every day. Because he will never run out of layers to uncover. I'm 61. I promise you, if I, by God's grace, live to be 91, we'll still be uncovering layers. My sweet, dear friend confessor, whose story I shared last Easter, who died on August the 27th of 2021, who I've just been missing terribly for the last 3 or 4 weeks, for just whatever reason, I'm just missing him terribly. I remember him saying, God's killing my body, and he's still after my shame and my sin. He's still pursuing me because he loves me. To the end, to the last moment. And that's Matthew's surprise. That is Matthew's surprise. And mine. That from the God of the universe every day, the finger doesn't come with what's wrong with you. It comes with, come close. Come right here. Jesus does a lot of things in my life that are bizarrely wild. I think because I don't get it enough. So in 2015, I'm in Israel. I haven't shared this story ever until recently. I shared it with some of the elders and some groups. I'm going to share it with you now because I've just gotten through living it the last 3 years. If you listen to my Life Reframed podcast, or what I do with Lauren Morgan, she and I co-create that weekly. If you listen to that, you know a little bit about my journey. I share some up here, but I share a lot more there. And you know these have been a hard 3 years in a lot of ways. God has taken me apart for a lot of unlearning so that I could learn. And as Lauren and I have talked with each other, our guests, it's become more apparent to me that was his whole design these last 3 years, and COVID was one of his high leverage points. But we're in Israel, and we're at the Sea of Galilee, and we're up on a hill, and there's this facility there that a group of people we were connected to were wanting to buy and purchase and have it for Jewish Christian young people, followers of Jesus who lived in Israel, and they were Hebrew. Of course, there was a huge need for such a facility. So as we're walking up on the property, and the guy said, hey, look around, you might see there's wild horses who run through here. My wife, if you know my wife at all, if you ever heard her on her podcast or ever talked to her, she's experiential and excitable. She was excited. She wanted the experience. Where are the horses? I'll pray, show me the horses. So she's looking around and we can't see any horses. So we just start praying. And while we're praying, the horses start walking up the road. Wild horses led by a big white horse. I'm like, man, this is like biblical stuff going on here. We're in Israel. Hey, how about that? In Israel, think about the New Testament. So here we are, right? Here comes the white horse. And he walks past everybody, and he turns toward me, and he buries his head in my chest. Hey, horse. Good to see you. Raised his head, looked at me, walked off. I said, God, what's that all about? That's what I want. This is a mess. That's what I want. This will disappoint you. This is what I want. This will disappoint my wife. It's actually what she wants. This will make it harder for me to lead at church. No, it won't. It'll just make it harder for you to fool people into how cool you are. This will lead me to failure. Yeah. Surrender. Yeah. I didn't understand at the time what that meant. I do now, after walking it through. And that's why I share this story years later. God did what he did to Matthew. And he said, all of you, I'm inviting you. All of you. This church is growing. If you go to kids ministry, I was supposed to be serving there this morning. Thankfully, JC took my place. I try to serve there once a month because they need the help. I hope you will too. If you go down there, if you go to our preteen, you go about anywhere in this church and things are exploding. That's a wonderful thing. I'm really thankful for that. But if it's not about this, it's a waste of our time. If it's not about raising up a generation over time and walking with them into adulthood and being their church and being their people and building their village, it's not going to work. If you don't have someone like Spencer who will teach this culture of worship you've experienced, this is the gospel. And so here's what surprises me about Jesus. You'd think I'd know this, but this really surprises me. This is how I answered my wife. The very things I least want to be a part of me, the very things I am most ashamed of, the very things that I would most want to hide, the very things that I feel like are the most disabling parts of who I am, the very things I want to distance myself from in myself are the very things Jesus wants first. Every day. Every day. Every day. Come follow me. Well, come follow me. And here's what I've learned. The worship team's going to come up now and just lead us. Y'all can come on up. Here's what I've learned. He's not telling me to go there. He's saying, I'm already here waiting on you. I'm here to meet you there. Now, hopefully it doesn't take a horse in Israel to get your attention. Or 2 years of therapy. Or having to work through the darkest parts of your marriage. Or having to go through what feels like deep failure in your leadership. Hopefully you won't have to do that, except probably you will. Because that's where the hope comes from. Would you stand with me? But when you sing this song, I want you to know what you're singing. If you want to see his glory, you're going to need to accept the invitation. Accept the invitation. for him to come to meet him in those dark places, those death places, those sin places, and find out that's what he wanted all along. And the glory is his, not ours.